So program note, as I mentioned yesterday, I'm going to yak a little bit, and then in the hallways, people are asking me questions and stuff. I said, save it for tomorrow. So that wasn't just trying to avoid you, but sometimes I think, we all kind of think, so we need to address this or that or the other thing. Not that I have the answers to these things, but perhaps it can advance our own conversation, and this has been a really wonderful, great time. So get your questions formulated. The poet Galway Kinnell says sometimes it's necessary to reteach a thing its loveliness. And the truth about that line of poetry is that we all feel this need to kind of be reminded of our own loveliness. And so we want to enter into this exquisite mutuality, into the joy of this two-way street. It's not a one-way street. Where we are all being called to kind of remind each other of the truth of who we are. So a homie named Dalo was telling me the other day he had gone on a field trip, kind of a class trip from ELAC, East LA College, to UC Berkeley. And so he was showing me some pictures. Well, he had shown these pictures from his cell to a woman on our senior staff, and she was looking at him and at the pictures, Davo in a sprawl plaza at UC Berkeley, and he's wearing a Homeboy shirt, and Homeboy Industries, jobs, not jails, and she gets tears in her eyes as she's looking at the pictures. She says, wow, Davo, you represented Homeboy. In fact, you were an ambassador for Homeboy Industries. And she had big tears. And Davo told me that, and he said, that shit made me feel good. And I don't even know what an ambassador is. And that's the sound of people reminding and reteaching and helping folks locate one more time their loveliness. Just right now, Caesar, we always going, and he left already, he said, can you give me a blessing? Because he was on his way to the fire camp thing with a whole group of people. And homies asked me for my blessing. This is a thing that's happened only in the last few years, A lot of times on websites or whatever, there's this shot of me giving somebody a blessing. And that's kind of new, Homies will ask me in the parking lot or on Alameda or, in the reception area, wherever, and they never say, Father, may I have your blessing. They always say, hey, G, give me a bless, yeah? It's always the same. And I remember a homie named Eric, who, 19 years old, gang member, an exasperating fellow, really, truth be told. And he always had two kind of modes. He was always quejándose. He was always complaining, usually about his supervisor or his case manager. My supervisor came at me sideways, and my case manager, she's not helping me for nothing, It's always the same, always quejándose. And he was also bien pediche. He was always asking for feria, mistaking me for the priest who was an ATM machine or whatever. And so he would never disappoint. And so this one Friday, I see him. He's the next to come in. I brace myself for Eric. Because, he's an orphan. And so there's a special place in my heart for the orphan. Because he had to raise himself, which kids aren't supposed to be any good at, and kids really aren't supposed to be asked to do that. So he did it, so you could sort of ignore his pediche, quejándose modalities, because he was an orphan. But he came in, and he didn't disappoint. He was asking me for feria and complaining from here till Tuesday, and when he was done, he said, hey, G, give me a bless, yeah? I said, okay, so he knows the drill. He comes over to my side of the desk and he bows his head very devoutly, and I put my hands on his shoulder, and we bow our heads, we close our eyes, and oh, so fortuitous that I remember right in that moment that it was his birthday the day before, and I neglected to saludarlo. And I remembered, and I said, Eric, I'm so glad you were born. You know, the world's a better place because you're in it. And I'm a rich man because you've changed my heart and altered my life. Ben, I'm the proudest man alive to call you my son. Even though, and I don't know why I added this next part, at times you can be a huge pain in the ass. He looked up at me and he smiled and he said, the feeling's mutual. And indeed it is, you know, but all we're trying to do together in this exquisite mutuality, in this feeling that is undeniably mutual, we're just trying to remind each other of our thorough goodness and our unadorned selves, reteaching loveliness. We talk a lot about healing, and we talk about how healing happens in relationship and how undeniable that is. And so we're all trying in our way in this exquisite mutuality to love each other into our own awakened hearts. Attunement is what Teresa was talking about yesterday. Whatever it takes, but it's all about just kind of being anchored in a love that's has a no matter whatness to it. And so we allow ourselves to be reached by the folks on the margins, and that's sort of a key thing for me, that you keep it mutual, that it's not a one-way street. I'm going out to the margins to rescue the folks on the margins, but rather you go to the margins so that we can all get rescued. It is how it works. It is how it's supposed to work. We go to the margins not to draw lines, but to erase them. So I get a lot of consolation from the original kind of commitment and covenant between God and God's people that says, as I have loved you, so must you have a special, particular, preferential love for the widow, orphan, and the stranger. And God sort of underscores these three subgroupings of the poor, because these are the folks who know what it's like to have been cut off. And because they have suffered this particular excruciating suffering, God thinks that they are trustworthy guides, folks who can lead the rest of us to a place of kinship and connection. One of my personal heroes was Pedro Rupe, who was a Jesuit, the Superior General of the Society of Jesus, and as Teresa explained, I'm a Jesuit priest along with Father Mark Torres. Or once somebody was giving a tour, and they stand in front of my office, and there's glass, and I'm talking to a homie, and I can hear them, observe our founder in his natural habitat, And this guy was kind of overly loud, and he says, "This is Father Greg Boyle. He is the founder and executive director of Homeboy Industries. He is a jiu-jitsu priest." So I gave him my best moves, and they seemed to be kind of impressed. Anyway, Pedro Rupe is a hero, and famously, he was the Superior General of the Society of Jesus for many years, and we all looked up to him as one of the holiest people we ever knew. And famously, he was in Hiroshima when they dropped the bomb, and there are kind of iconic images of him just moving directly toward the place of explosion when everybody else was walking in the opposite direction. He had this determined march straight to the place where things had exploded. So famously, once he was in Brazil, kind of visiting, and part of the Superior General is to go around the world and visit Jesuits. And he runs into a very poor man who says, I want you to come to my house because I have a gift for you. And so Pedro Rupi goes to this man's house, and when they enter what is a hovel, Pedro Rupi gets so overwhelmed with emotion because it's just so abject poverty as he has never seen it. But the man walks Pedro Rupi through the house to get to the gift. And the gift was a window, but it was really more of just a big old hole in the wall. And he says, come here, stand with me. And through the hole, the two of them watched the sunset. You could see it perfectly. And what was the gift? The view from here. And that's always kind of stayed with me. It's the thing that matters. It is why you go to the margins, not to save the day, not to save the world, but to savor it. And you go to the margins because you're going to be given a gift, which of course is the view from here. All of us in our way, and I really love our size. I don't ever want to go to a big-ass hotel, you know. I like that we fit in this room because we're all kind of on the same page and in the same boat. We're all trying to create a certain kind of community, a sanctuary, if you will, a community of tenderness, which is always seeking to promote resilience. And then the homies go home and they create in their own families this sanctuary, this community of tenderness, where their kids in turn become resilient. And this is what it looks like when people say, break the cycle. It's not about delivering a menu of services. We always get tripped up by that. We sit back and we go, what do those folks need? And we do the usual suspects of menu, from anger management to parenting to character building to whatever it might be. It's not about delivering a menu of services. It's about creating a sanctuary, a community of tenderness from which those services can be delivered. So I've been thinking lately about kind of in the scope of social movements and thought. And so you have 1970, Paulo Freire in Brazil with the pedagogy of the oppressed, conscientization. So it's consciousness raising. How do we get the folks on the margins to see how oppressed they are, to understand the sinful social structures that oppress them, and how do we get them to take action to address the oppressor? Then in 1987, you have Julian Rappaport, and you have the notion of empowerment, and it was supposed to get away from that paternalistic, we will help you, poor people, folks on the margins. No, you can do it yourself. Both are good and both are helpful. I want to suggest that the Global Homeboy Network has its own kind of principle, which I call ennobilization. Our exquisite mutuality in going out to the margins makes something happen for everyone. Everyone is retaught their loveliness. And so you go to the margins and you insist on not reaching them, but allowing yourself to be reached. You go to the margins and you insist on not yakking at people. You insist on not wagging your finger in any way, but helping folks on the margins put their finger on it. You insist on receiving who they are and valuing and honoring who they are. And then you step back and everyone starts to feel honorable. everyone starts to inhabit their own sovereignty and power. Everyone feels and inhabits their own nobility. I think what we're about is really ennobilization. It's not a thing I give to that homie, but we're privileged to be in this place where the feeling's mutual, where we both discover our own honor, and we live from that place of sovereignty. A lot of cities I go to give talks, and everybody just wants to change behavior. How do we change the antisocial norms? And that's difficult for me because I think that's short-sighted. It's not about stopping violence. It's about providing people with what they need so they can become healthy and striving and thriving. We want to be able to create this sanctuary, this place where that can happen. Otherwise, it's like quelling and calming the cough of a lung cancer patient without addressing the underlying lung cancer. It's a little bit as well like the current thinking on homelessness. You've got, there was the old notion, which is measure up. Here's the bar. We'll give you your own apartment, homeless person, but you have to measure up. You have to deal with all your issues. You have to be solid in your recovery. You have to basically be without any kind of issues at all, and then we'll give you your apartment. But now there's this new thinking that says, no, sanctuary first. Safe, stress-free apartment. Why? Because just like Demi, you've got survival brain. How am I going to get through this day? I have to walk to school and there are people, I have to watch my back. This is survivor brain. And that's hard, it's stressful. And so people self-medicate and then people try to deal with the stress as best they can. And people are only expecting the next bad thing to happen to them. Instead, at Homeboy, we would say, come on in. It's not about, we're not going to measure your readiness. In fact, in our interview process, we measure your surliness, We measure your belligerence. And we go, yeah, you are really an exasperating human being. Come on in. Because it means that you want somebody to have this palpable experience of sanctuary. Safe and stress-free. Okay, you got it. Can you breathe? Are you starting to feel your own nobility? Okay, now let's deal with all the stuff you got to deal with. Recovery. Get your driver's license. Baby mama drama. Whatever it is, whatever the issue is, we can help you with it. So as a society, part of what we want to do is we want to move, from blame and shame and punishment to understanding and nurturing and healing. And so you whatever it takes, but we take people where they are. True enough, they have to walk through the door, but they don't have to be finished products when they arrive at your place. I was talking to this guy, John, who worked at Homeboy many years ago, and I'm always curious about what makes the light bulb go off. And he said, I remember it as if it was yesterday, a very specific moment. He was walking in the projects in his barrio. He had a gun tucked into the front of his pants. He gets in front of a Catholic church and he blesses himself. And there's an old woman over here who's selling raspados, and she says in Spanish, hey, can I ask you a question? He says, sure. Why did you just persinarse right now? Well, I'm asking God to protect me. And she laughed and she said, well, that's funny. And he said, why? Well, because given what you do in this community, all the rest of us ask God to protect us from you. And he said, I went home next day I walked into Homeboy Industries. It takes what it takes in recovery. But just because you walk through the doors doesn't mean you're ready to hang up your gloves, if I can mix my metaphors. You take people where they're at, and it requires a modicum of decision and a teeny bit of willingness. And then you go. Another way of speaking of healing is to be initiated into your true self. And this is kind of how we see it at Homeboy Industries. Homeboy Industries wants to be a rite of passage because that's kind of a necessary thing. You have to re-identify who you are. If you thought courage was packing a gun, then it takes a lot of mechanical thinking and gymnastics to say, okay, I can see that that has nothing to do with courage. And then you get to this place where in any rite of passage you destabilize the ego. The false self falls away and you embrace your newborn nobility. And you become the truth of who you are, that you are exactly what God always ever had in mind when God made you. And that's huge. Unless the grain of wheat dies, that's kind of what this is about. So when a homie named Louis says, all I thought I ever wanted was to be the biggest, baddest gang member in town. And then he looked at me and he said, I was disguised as that guy. And then you end up finding this honorable, noble person who's thoroughly good and has stripped away all false sense of who this self might be. Years ago, there was a homie named Lulu who I knew in the projects, and he belonged to a gang and sold crack cocaine for a living. And then suddenly he became his own best customer. And as much as you suggest to people, maybe it's time to, get some help, it takes what it takes, and he resisted for a very long time until finally he didn't. And so I drove him to a mountaintop rehab center where he was on his way to recovery. But he was there 30 days when his younger brother Eric did something that gang members don't ever do. He holds a gun to his head and he took his own life. Gang members are more likely to walk into enemy territory and just hope to die. So I called Lulu and I said, I'm going to come pick you up for the funeral. He was, of course, devastated with the news. And I said, but I'm going to bring you right back after the funeral. And Lulu was very quick. He said, I want you to. I like what recovery feels like. So I go pick him up, and we greet each other, and we get in the car, and he launches right into a story about a dream he had the night before, and he said, you were in it. And we'll say we were in a room this size, but there were no lights, no windows, no illuminated exit signs, no light creeping under the door, pitch black. We're in silence. But somehow he knows I'm there. And suddenly in the silence I reach into my pocket and I pull out a flashlight and I aim it steadily at the light switch on the wall, and I don't move and I don't speak. And Lulu seems to know in the telling of this dream that he's the only person who can turn that light switch on. He's really grateful that I happen to have a flashlight. So he follows this steady beam of light very slowly, very tentatively, and he gets to the light switch. And when he gets there, as he's telling the story, he's sobbing now. He's just crying like a baby. And he sighs this huge sigh of great fear and anxiety, and he flips the light switch on. And I'll never forget how he said this. He said, the light, the room was flooded with light, and the light is better than the darkness. Like he didn't exactly know that to be the case. And he said, I guess my brother just never found the light switch. Well, everyone in this room who creates a community of tenderness, a sanctuary of acceptance, happens to own a flashlight, and you all happen to know where to aim it. And that may not feel like enough for you, but it has to be. And so consequently, all our initiation rites try to figure out what to do with our pain. And so we decide not to get rid of it until it has taught us what it must. I knew a guy filled with pain, but he found somehow, some way, in the sanctuary of tenderness at Homeboy Industries, a way to make sense of it. And his name was Trayvon. And he would always go to the second floor of Homeboy Industries, and he would every day do this routine where he'd clap very loudly. And then he'd say, "Stay focused, people." And all the heads would go up from the cubicles like a bunch of meerkats, you know. And everybody would laugh, and it was the routine that never got old. And I remember I took him and another guy to San Francisco. I was going to speak to the Youth for America, like 1,000 young people in Oakland. So we did Alcatraz, and we ate seafood that required bibs. And he had a good time, both of them. And then after my talk to all of these young people, I watched he and this other guy, Miguel, they were holding court, and all these people, Youth for America volunteers, are gathering around, mainly females. And they're all just like this, you know, and they're talking, and finally I look at Trey and I go, and it's like 3 in the afternoon, and he brings it to a close, and as we're walking to our car, I said, wow, those ladies sure seemed interested in what you guys had to say. And Trayvon said, "Let's just say we were reaping the benefits of your talk." Apparently. And he said, "Damn, gee, that just made me feel proper right now." I said, "What did?" "Well, when you pointed at your watch, I told him we had to leave, and this female says, 'Do you got to go?' And I said, 'Yes. Got a flight to catch.'" I've never said that sentence in my whole life. Got a flight to catch. In fact, we're catching the red eye. I said, "Well, Doc, we're leaving at 4 in the afternoon. And red eye is at night, and you fly at night. When you get there, your eyes are red because you didn't get any sleep." I'm like, damn, I shouldn't have said that. Anyway, he said, made me feel like I was somebody. And who can explain exactly things as when Trayvon was gunned down at a picnic when all hell broke loose. And then you're at his funeral and you're telling a packed mortuary in Inglewood that Trayvon had a flight to catch, knowing that somehow he had landed solidly on the truth of who he was. And then you discover that death has no power over that. That's a good thing to discover. And so folks with disrupted childhoods, whose biography suddenly becomes biology, need a healing place. And that's what all of you provide in all the cities and countries from which you hail. I was invited to speak in Palm Springs, and I'll end with this. I brought 2 homies with me, Frankie and Saul. And so I was going to give the keynote, but then they had a workshop, and I always give the homies the workshop, and the workshop was on mentoring. And so I had dinner with them the night before, you know, where we had steaks. And the waiter asked Frankie, "How do you want your steak?" He said, "Overwhelmed." I don't know where that falls, you know, somewhere between well done and rare. So he had never had steak before. So when I said, "Well, you're going to do it," so try to identify a mentor you had, and so that's what they did. And so I gave my keynote, and I said, "You guys are on. Tell parts of your story first, and then get to the mentor part." And it was the two of them. And Frankie got up, and Frankie, his face is covered in tattoos, but all the tattoos are different versions of his gang. Let me call them the 59th Street gang or something. So it's written in English, written in Old English, written in Roman numerals, written in Sanskrit. I don't know what the hell. His whole face is covered. So right away, this audience of 300 in a ballroom think they know who this guy is because he's just telegraphed it by way of his tattoos. And then he gets up and he talks about his household, parents, gang members, drug addicts, sold drugs. The place was kind of a crack house, lots of people in it. And he had lots of kids, brothers and sisters. But at 9 years old, he couldn't take it, so he ran away from home. And then he tells everybody in the audience that his sister told him later on when he finally came home that it took his mom 1 month before she asked this question. "Anybody here see Frankie?" And then he looks at the audience and he says, 1 month, imagine. And the truth is we couldn't imagine it. Then he gets to the mentor part. He says there was a guy named Rafa. He lived next door. I was 10. He was like 17. He was in high school. Every day, he knew what my house was like. So he rescued me every day. He walked me to school every day. Every day. He rescued me. And he gave me good advices. He was always telling me stuff. Don't walk in that alley. Avoid that street. See those guys over there? Don't talk to those guys. Yeah. He gave me good advices. One day he said to me, "I'm going to graduate from high school and so will you. I'm going to go to college and so will you. I'm going to go to medical school and I'm going to become a doctor. And I'm going to come back and take you with me. And you'll be my son." Frankie's getting emotional speaking of this. In fact, he stopped speaking, staring at a piece of his story only he could see. Then he snapped out of it. He said, "Yeah, one day he came and he picked me up. He was walking me to school as he did every day. But those guys over there across the street, one of them yelled, 'Where are you from?' And Rafa said, 'Keep walking, Frankie, keep walking.' And the guy said it again, 'Where are you from?' And Rafa said, 'Walk more quickly now.' Then all of a sudden, the guy from across the street is standing right in front of Rafa. He says, 'I asked you, where are you from?' And before Rafa can say, 'I ain't from nowhere,' Frankie says, 'my face was splattered with blood. And I looked down on the ground and there was Rafa staring at me with his eyes wide open, gasping for air. But what could I do? I was 10 years old. And by the time anybody came to help, Rafa was dead. And then nothing prepared us for what he did next. He just began to sort of sob in a heaving, wailing way where he doubled his body over. And we didn't know what to do as an audience. We felt as powerless as a 10-year-old boy with blood splattered on his face. But then nothing prepared us for what Frankie did next. He righted himself. He found his own sovereignty and nobility and honorable self, born of a community that accepted him without measure and without regret, born of a sanctuary that held him in tenderness. He was able to stand straight up and tell this audience, I didn't speak for a month. I did not utter one word for 30 days. And he looks at us and he says, imagine a month. And suddenly, we could all imagine it. We had moved beyond who we thought this guy was. And awe filled us. We all stood in awe at what this kid had to carry rather than judgment, how he ended up carrying it. And so we, in our communities of tenderness, we help everybody, including ourselves, not to get rid of our pain until it's taught us what it must. And you let go of the old version of yourself, unless the grain of wheat dies. And the opposite of clinging is not letting go, really. The opposite of clinging is cherishing. And so you can go into the world and be a part of this noble venture that ennobilizes. And so we are suddenly again seized by tenderness, and suddenly again choosing to decide to live in each other's hearts. And indeed, it's sometimes necessary to reteach a thing its loveliness.